Welcome to this first video on the unit on witches and witch hunting in the early modern period. This is a very general introduction. A lot of the themes in this video are going to be picked up in more detail in other videos, but this is a great place to start, good introduction. So the question we're going to consider today is why the witch hunts happened when they did. They didn't happen in the Middle Ages. They were not a medieval phenomenon. So why did it take until the early modern period for the first large-scale witch hunts to get going? So some important definitions to make for this video and all of the other videos in the series about what we mean when we say certain key terms like witchcraft. So witchcraft is harmful magic, sometimes called maleficia. Therefore, witches are these practitioners of maleficia, of harmful magic. And when I talk about the witch hunts in these videos, I'm talking about the organized legal persecution of suspected witches that took place in the 16th and 17th century. So mainly in the 1500s and 1600s, approximately 40,000 women were executed in Europe. And it is mainly women. Now, that doesn't mean it's all women. It ranged from 75 to 85% women, sometimes higher, sometimes lower than that. In some areas, it was overwhelmingly men, but as a rule of thumb, we're looking at about 80% women, if not higher, overall. Now, this is a timeline to show you pretty much how the witch hunts developed. Now, the first large-ish scale witch hunts took place at the end of the Middle Ages, just before the beginning of the early modern period in the Alps, in the Italian and French Alps. There was more prosecution of witches from the 1480s to the 1520s in those following areas. Then the period 1520s to 1560s, there's a drop-off. So it gets going a bit, but then it drops right off. And one of the reasons for this is that the Reformation is going on at this time, and perhaps authorities are more worried about maintaining religious discipline. So there's a drop off. But then from the 1560s, there is a period of quite rapid increase in the number of women and men being persecuted for witchcraft. And in the 1630s, it starts to go down. So there's a sort of peak between the 1560s and 1630s. Then generally it starts to go down. There are outbreaks in other places where it does go up suddenly, but as a rule, it's going down by them. And it continues to generally decline until in the 1700s, countries start actually repealing, taking back any laws against witches that they've made. And the last ever execution for witchcraft was in Switzerland in 1782, very late. Now, there's much more information about the decline of witchcraft and how that happened and the reasons for it in the video that deals with that. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, there were no real large-scale witch hunts, and that's because attitudes were quite different. If you pause this and have a read of it, then I'll talk about it in a minute. Right, so this is an 11th century document from the 1000s from the Bishop of Worms, and he describes women that believe they're witches as being seduced by the illusions of phantasms of demons. In other words, the church was arguing this was an imaginary crime, that the devil had the power to seduce people into thinking certain things but had no real power over them. So these are misguided women. They're not really flying around casting spells. It's all in their head. And this dates back to something called the Canon Episcopi, which was a document produced by the church that said that witchcraft was illusory, it was imagined. And any women that believed this were either being deluded by the devil or actually might just be what we call melancholy, or what they called melancholy, which could describe any number of sort of what we would describe as mental health issues today. And yet, this does change in the early modern period, but it doesn't change for a long time. There is this medieval belief that it's a misguided superstition, that there's no real such thing as witches. And so when the church dealt with this, and the church did deal with it, they dealt with it in a lenient way. They did not punish these women They often would just make them apologize. There would be a small act of penance of some description, praying, whatever. But the church did not go around killing witches in the Middle Ages. Now, in the early modern period, we get 40,000 women executed for being witches. So what changed? Right, here's some key vocab that we're going to use throughout this course. Might be a good idea to pause this and just note them down. So let's start now by looking at what people did believe about witches and witchcraft in the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, already there was this strong belief that most ordinary people had, that there were supernatural powers and people could use them, sometimes for good magic, sometimes for harmful magic. This was nothing new in the Middle Ages. It actually dates right back to before the Middle Ages, to pagan times, to the times of the Greeks and the Romans. So it's a key ingredient, isn't it? A belief that some people can perform magic. It's a key ingredient, but obviously this ingredient on its own was not enough to cause a witch hunt. We mentioned earlier that the church dealt with witches in the Middle Ages, and they regarded it as a superstition, so therefore they were very lenient, a lot of sympathy for some of the women that were accused, even those that freely confessed because they believed they were deluded. But this does start to change. In the 1420s and 1430s, you get those Alpine witch hunts. But right up until that period, right up until the end of the Middle Ages, it's the church dealing with this and not taking it seriously at all. Now, what there was at this time, though, was a religious attitude about women. And remember, it's women who later on mainly get accused of being witches. And there is this long-standing belief that the church had about women being easily tempted by the Bible, being weaker than men, lustful, and therefore perhaps more easily tempted by the devil. However, this is a long-held belief all the way through the Middle Ages, and yet there's still no witch hunt. So this on its own, along with the other thing, still not enough to cause a witch hunt. Possibly this is because the church at this time is much more, and the authorities are much more worried about heretics, people that dissent, that argue, that move away from the official teachings of the church. And there were three groups that they were most worried about: the Cathars, Waldensians, and the Lollards. You don't really need to know what they believed, but the church was fearful of them. And already, even in the Middle Ages, the church identified these heretical groups, these groups of heretics, with the devil. They said that they were anti-Christian and that they were doing the devil's work. And you can see in these pictures, you've also got some of the features that you would later see identified with witchcraft in the early modern period. More of that later. So let's just sum this up. So in the Middle Ages, you've got the existing belief in magic and maleficia. You've got this misogynistic attitude towards women, but it's the church courts who are dealing with witches. They don't take it particularly seriously because they're more worried about heresy. So you've got some of the ingredients that you might need for a witch hunt, but there's no widespread or organised campaign against witches. And there are also no laws made against witches by rulers and secular authorities, non-church authorities. And the proof is in the pudding, really, or in the statistics. If you look at this graph showing you statistics for southwest Germany, which was probably the epicenter of the witch hunts, you can see that before the early modern period, there's this tiny little peak here, but this is an early modern phenomena. The ingredients needed for a witch hunt just simply weren't in place throughout most of the Middle Ages. So why does that change? Well, it changes because of new attitudes towards witchcraft that come along in the early modern period towards, well, the early modern period, start of the early modern period and the end of the Middle Ages. So two pictures here. Picture of heretics from the Middle Ages on the left and an early modern image of witches on the right. And there's some overlap, isn't there? Flight, riding demonic looking goats, meeting at night, large scale, numbers of people getting together, demons actually in some of these pictures as well. And so what's happened is the idea from heresy in the Middle Ages of a diabolical pact, the idea that heretics were in league with the devil, doing a deal with the devil, it migrates this idea in the early modern period to witchcraft. It gets incorporated in the idea of witches. And if you think about it, in the Middle Ages, they believed that witches were deluded old women, and these deluded old women were supposed to be doing harmful magic or thinking they were doing harmful magic. It's not that serious, but now they seem to be in league with the devil, the enemy of God himself. And this begins during these first Alpine witch hunts. These are the first ones where witches are no longer accused of just using maleficia or harmful magic. They are also accused of being in a pact with the devil. And people write about this as well. We get what are called demonologies, which are books about witches and witchcraft. One of the most important one was called The Ant Hill by a man called Johann Neider, and it emphasized this diabolical pact, this agreement between witches and the devil. It said that witches were a secret society, they were a threat to Christian society. Um, but actually, interestingly, at this stage, um, witches are identified as men and women. So it's argued that women are more susceptible to temptation, but actually the leadership roles of these secret societies of witches are carried out by men. Then a bit later on in 1484, the Pope starts to um, get involved in this, and he says, there is a problem with witchcraft. It's an exceptional crime. It's hard to find evidence to prove it, so you should be allowed to deal with this in different ways. So you should be allowed to torture suspects. If there's a lack of evidence, you can force them into making a confession, naming accomplices. And then you get the publication of perhaps the biggest, most influential textbook almost on witches, a demonology of witches, that was used as guidance by many witch persecutors in later centuries. It was printed over and over again, the Malleus Maleficarum. And in this, we get the first overt argument that witches are invariably women. Witchcraft is the worst form of heresy. It's heresy, it's murder, it's cannibalism, it's magic, it's all of those things. And he argues that you have to treat it mercilessly and stamp it out. Now, all of this is explored in much more detail in the video I've made about the intellectual developments of the witch hunt. This is just a quick overview. So by the 1500s, there's also a new ingredient, this belief in the Sabbat, that witches might fly or be magically transported to a meeting called the Sabbat. Now, this wasn't believed everywhere, but in a lot of places in Europe it was. And it goes along with this idea that there are large numbers, a conspiracy of witches, and they are in league with the devil. And at these Sabbats, they make a pact with the devil in all sorts of ways. There'll be demons there, and cannibalistic infanticide and murder, killing children, eating them, all kinds of things. Now, a lot of this horrible stuff, it wasn't new, but what was new is the fact it was now being attached to witches. In the past, this had been something attached to heretics. So all of these ideas have migrated by the early modern period onto witches. So now the state starts to take it very seriously. The authorities, the non-church authorities, the rulers, the kings, the princes, the dukes, etc., etc., they regard witchcraft as a very serious crime. They go along with this idea that the Pope said that it's exceptional. So the secular courts are now much more involved. Witch hunting wasn't really driven by the church anymore in the early modern period. It was driven by non-church courts, secular courts. So there's a greater use of torture. The testimony of children starts to be accepted, and crucially, kings and queens and dukes and princes, etc., start making laws against witchcraft. Now, in those areas where the church carried on dealing with cases of witchcraft, actually there were no large-scale witch hunts. So even though fear of witches was in part driven by religious attitudes, in those areas where the church as an organization is running the show, running the trial system, there are no big large-scale witch hunts. It's a secular phenomenon. Right, so the historian Brian Levac, who is probably the foremost author on the witch hunts, I think, anyway, talks about there being, by the 15th century, so by the late 1400s, he talks about there being a cumulative notion of witchcraft. In other words, most of the ingredients, or all of the ingredients you need to have a witch hunt, are in place and associated with witchcraft. So you've got the existing belief in maleficia, which goes right back through the Middle Ages, the existing attitudes about women being easily tempted, which goes right back through the Middle Ages. But now you've also got in the early modern period as well this belief in the diabolical fact, this belief that witches are making this agreement with the devil and are a threat to Christian society. So there's this sort of big secret sect of witches trying to bring down Christian society. In a lot of places, you start to get an accompanying belief in the Sabbat. There's meetings of witches, large-scale meetings, where terrible things go on. And because of this fear, this greater fear, now it's not the church going to look for witches, it's the state that are dealing with witchcraft trials and prosecutions. And Lavac points also to the idea that came from the Pope, did come from the church, that witchcraft was an exceptional crime. So the usual rules about investigating crimes go out of the window. So that means you can have more torture and things like that. Now, all of the ones with a star by them are ideas that were originally attached to heresy, but by the early modern period had migrated over to the notion of witchcraft. And so witchcraft ends up being seen as the ultimate form of heresy, the most wicked thing you can do. So you can have all of these ingredients, this cumulative notion of witchcraft, but still you can have areas where there are no witch hunts. And that's because every area was different, different conditions, different triggers. So there are certain key ingredients you must have, but you also need something else to cause a witch hunt. And Bralovac says it was necessary for the ruling elite, those people in charge of the courts and the laws, to believe that witchcraft was the crime of the greatest magnitude and that it was being practiced on a large scale and in a conspiratorial manner. If the elites, if the people in charge of the legal system don't buy into this, then you don't get a witch hunt. You might have people believing this stuff, but if the laws don't, the people making the laws and running the investigations and the trials, etc., if they don't buy into this, then you don't get a witch hunt. So he says it's a judicial thing more than anything. So what does that leave us? Well, you can have all of these things and still no witch hunt. So you would, to have a witch hunt, you need to apply a bit of heat to this cauldron full of ingredients. And heat could come from various things, different things in different areas, actually. Social and economic changes might be the thing that gets all of this going. So you've got scapegoats. You might get political change. You might get religious changes. You might have a crisis, a war, diseases, which cause people to blame witches. Now, that was different in different areas. And that's the thing that makes this course so interesting. It's never the same in two areas. But broadly speaking, we can say that without those ingredients up there, you don't get a witch hunt. These are necessary preconditions for the witch hunt. But even with those, it's not enough. You need a trigger or another factor to get things going, to cause some kind of demand to persecute witches, to drive that. All right. Hopefully that provides you with a quite clear overview.